I want to do something a little bit different with today's video, and what I want to do is to share with you a true story of a situation that happened to me about a year or so ago, and how something that was seemingly so unrelated to the human body taught me such a profound lesson when it came to actually finding the best strategy to approach to actually obtain long-term health benefits. So if you are somebody who's suffering with a painful and restrictive chronic ailment, and no matter what you try to do, you just can't seem to shake off any of the symptoms of it, then hear me out, because I believe that the message of today's video is something that's very important to carry forward with you. Right, so I have a laptop that I like to edit my videos on, and this laptop runs very powerfully and quickly, and the reason I decided to pick this laptop in the first place was so that I could edit and render videos relatively straightforwardly. I didn't want any issues arising with programs freezing or crashing. About a year or so ago, seemingly out of nowhere, the speed of the laptop just completely tanked. I think it went from about 4.2 gigahertz to 0.78 gigahertz, which is a greater than 5 times reduction in speed. In tandem with this drop in speed, a ton of other adverse effects came about, seemingly all at once, that made it virtually impossible for me to edit videos. Certain programs just wouldn't load, the video editing software continued to freeze and crash, and certain devices just wouldn't connect to the USB ports. Everything was just a complete mess, and so I did the only thing that I felt I could do at the time, which was to delve the internet to search for potential solutions to the problem. I watched a bunch of videos on YouTube, typed in loads of things on Google, and read through a ton of online tech forums. And these things all provided me with so many suggestions that I decided to go ahead and implement some of them. I restarted the laptop, I downloaded various programs, I updated certain drivers, I changed some of the inbuilt settings within the laptop itself, and to my frustration, none of these things made the blindest bit of difference. But then I suddenly remembered something that happened just a few days before all of these adverse effects came about. I was sat there with my laptop on my lap, and I moved it in a particular way where there was a sudden tiny snapping sound, and it came from the charging port, which is the part of the laptop that connects the laptop with the cable. This sound was so subtle that I thought absolutely nothing of it at the time, and so I continued to just keep using the laptop as normal. But what I later came to find out was that a tiny piece of plastic inside the charging port had actually snapped off. And I've actually got the specific piece of the laptop here. So if I show you the inside here by shining a light in it, you see how there's a tiny ring of black plastic on the inside of this piece? Well, that's a fully functional piece. And if I change it with this one, which is the one that snapped in my laptop, can you see how that black ring of plastic isn't actually inside that one? So that was the tiny bit of damage that was incurred by my laptop. Anyway, I took the whole laptop apart to change this single piece, and when I did, I turned it back on, and I was shocked to see that the speed had increased back up to 4.2 gigahertz. Suddenly, certain devices were being recognized in the USB ports, and the whole laptop just suddenly became 10 times more functional. So I was enormously relieved, but also bewildered as to why this came about in the first place. And then what I later came to find out was that a certain inbuilt safety mechanism had been triggered within the laptop itself the moment this piece of plastic snapped off. And the purpose of that mechanism was to slow down the laptop's performance to prevent it from overheating. So even though the laptop continued to be able to charge, something within its inbuilt hard wiring severed the connection between it and the mains electricity, and as a result it severely limited its potential to function up to the levels that it should have been functioning at. But fundamentally, the reason why this mechanism was deployed in the first place and then continued to remain there was because the laptop was protecting itself from encountering a much bigger problem. And this is really the point where I want to establish the link between this analogy and the human body. But just before I do, if you haven't yet already done so, I highly advise you to take a look at my online course, The Unbeatable Blueprint. This 5-hour video course will completely change the way you view the human body and your chronic condition, and this change in paradigm will allow you to achieve levels of health that you never truly thought possible. This situation that happened with my laptop is so intimately tied in with the human body and chronic illness recovery that as soon as this happened to me, I just knew I had to make a video on the topic, especially as I frequently refer to the human body as being like a biological computer. The first thing that really stood out to me was the fact that one small issue could go on to create such a multitude of undesirable downstream effects. And in the case of the laptop, one tiny little defect in the form of a broken bit of plastic then went on to cause the whole system to function way below its threshold. And if I were to compare this with the human body, then hidden dysfunctions or lesions existing within our brain or sensory nervous system can then go on to create imbalances involving our cognitive, sensory motor and limbic system function. And this can often manifest as widespread symptoms that are regularly experienced by those living with a chronic autonomic or autoimmune condition. So basically, the single cause that we haven't yet been able to identify is ironically the thing that's most likely responsible for creating the ton of negative effects that we experience, which are also the things that we're trying so desperately to fix. That really links into the second point that I want to bring up, and that's me making so many software changes to my laptop to ultimately try to resolve what ended up being a hardware issue. This approach just caused the laptop to continue to revert back to working suboptimally. And the reason for that was because the overriding issue was still present and unaddressed. What I failed to recognise was that these abnormal outputs that my laptop was displaying weren't the problem, but they were a reflection of an input problem that was the thing that really needed addressing. This is really comparable to when chronic illness sufferers constantly adopt one treatment modality after another in order to try to fix the symptoms that are going on within them. They might try various diets, supplement protocols, and other health practices. They constantly browse the internet looking for solutions to their chronic symptoms. But what they fail to realise is that more often than not, these symptoms are primarily outputs that are being continuously produced by their brain, and that the real problem that likely needs addressing is within inbuilt input systems existing within neural networks. There's a strong possibility that your body might already have everything that it needs to recover currently contained within it. It's just that these input systems need to be sufficiently assessed and then trained back up to the levels that they were originally designed to function at. The third point that I really want to bring up is the fact that in order to work up to its full potential, the laptop had to safely receive and process an electrical input from a source that was outside of itself, and that source being the mains outlet. And as soon as this connection was disrupted, the laptop started to perform at just a fraction of its potential. And whilst many people probably aren't aware, the human body actually works in a very similar way, where we have certain receptors existing within our sensory nervous system called mechanoreceptors. and they take on board various sensory stimuli from our external environment. This information that's taken on board is then converted into a neuronal or an electrical signal to be sent up to the brain. And one of the primary ways that the human body actually charges itself electrically is by certain mechanoreceptors sensing vibrations amongst the Earth's gravitational pull. If lesions or dysfunctions were to appear in these receptors, widespread issues would likely follow, because the body would both struggle to harness enough energy, and also it would struggle to decode certain aspects of its external environment, which would then in turn cause it to expel a lot more energy. These factors together can leave us with a body that provides us with such little amounts of expendable energy to actually go about our everyday with. And it's such a key reason as to why chronic fatigue and symptomatic crashes are so prevalent amongst sufferers of these long-standing conditions. Another good observation to make is notice how my laptop went into its safety mode when it sensed that there were issues with how it took on board input in the form of electrical power. And how often do you hear of somebody with a chronic condition refer to their body as being in its safety or survival mode? And the reason for this is because actually a similar situation is occurring where their body is having issues accurately interpreting sensory inputs from its environment, and as a result, their brain is limiting their body's physical capabilities. What all of these events ultimately taught me was that the laptop was originally designed perfectly, and that the solution to the problem was to actually restore it back to its original state, because once this was achieved, I could then trust it to run as it was intended to run. This phenomenon is so comparable to the human body and chronic conditions, as we spend so much time trying to find new hacks and experimenting with various modalities to try to fix symptoms that are occurring throughout our body. But what we often fail to realise is that nature and evolution designed our bodies to run in a very specific way, and if we're not using this way as our primary benchmark to work backwards and to restore our body to its original and most functional state, then all we'll end up doing is going round and round in circles, adopting one treatment modality after another. And this whole video really typifies why I'm such a big advocate for having the function of your brain and sensory nervous system thoroughly assessed and then any dysfunctions addressed. Because once you are able to fine-tune the function of these input systems, they in turn should then go on to produce more desirable long-term outputs. And you'll probably come to experience this in the form of increased energy levels, decreased symptoms, and an all-round improvement in your physical and mental health.